As I've grown older, I've come to recognize that the most profound insights into the human psychology don't come from the likes of Sigmund Freud or Erik Erikson or even B.F. Skinner, but from children's fables. And the war on energy, which is my subject today, brings to mind one of them, the story of Chicken Little. Now, for those of you who just remember the title, Chicken Little was having lunch when an acorn fell on her head. She concluded the sky was falling, and she went off to tell the king. She figured the king would know what to do. Well, on her way, she met Henny Penny, Goosey Lucy, and Cocky Locky, and she explained the situation to them, and they all agreed to come, drop what they were doing, and go and tell the king. Then they met Foxy Loxy, who offered to help, and at that point, the versions of the story differ. The most famous version, Foxy Loxy eats two of them, and Cocky Locky manages to warn Chicken Little, who escapes. Then there's another version where Foxy Loxy eats the whole lot. And then there's the modern sanitized version where no one gets eaten. And you have the king's dogs come along, and they chase Foxy Loxy, who runs away. And there's the requisite happy ending for modern children. In its pre-boulderized form, the story is a psychological gem. There's the human readiness to believe in apocalypse. There is the very thin evidence, virtually no evidence, on which this belief is based. And there's the ease with which others are convinced. Because the others, one of them was looking for berries, one of them was looking for seeds, and it was not difficult. You drop everything in a higher cause, namely to to save the earth. And finally, there are the terrible consequences of blind, ill-informed belief. The modern environmentalist movement has been so successful because it draws upon these aspects of the human psyche. There is the fear of apocalypse. Environmentalists careen from one to another. The most successful, they really hit a home run with a global warming apocalypse. It doesn't matter how spurious or how thin the evidence is. Believers find it relatively easy to persuade others to throw themselves into the task of saving the earth. And of course, the environmental enthusiasts are not as smart as whoever wrote the story of Chicken Little, because they don't see the doom down the road if their earth-saving program is followed. The very absurdity of their ideas works in their favor. That's because the average person simply can't believe that the environmentalists hold the beliefs that they do. Back in 1993, Dixie Lee Ray, speaking to this organization, made much the same point. And Governor Ray quoted a number of these people. To me, perhaps the most shocking was David Brower, who was the founder of Friends of the Earth. And he told a convention of loggers in British Columbia, and I quote, "Loggers losing their jobs because of the spotted owl legislation is in my eyes no different from people being put out of work after the furnaces of Dachau shut down." He should have said Auschwitz, because Dachau didn't have furnaces, but put that aside. I guess you have to credit him with guts. Dixie Lee Ray said it was a miracle he got out of British Columbia alive after saying that. But she provided another example, another quote, this one from a bureaucrat from the National Park Service, which I saw, by the way, quoted in Mark Levin's new book. It was a op-ed in the LA Times. Here's the quote, "I know social scientists who remind me that people are a part of nature. That just isn't true. We have become a plague upon ourselves and upon the earth. Some of us can only hope for the right virus to come along." Well, somebody talked about being anti-life. This would be rather a good example. She quoted Maurice Strong, who served as head of the UN Environmental Program, and who was the chief organizer of the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. Strong argued that unless we opted for what he called sustainable development, I'm sure you've heard that phrase often, our planet would soon become uninhabitable. Strong never said what sustainable development was, but he said what it wasn't. It was clear, he said, that use of fossil fuels, ownership of motor vehicles, ownership of small electrical appliances, house and workplace air conditioning, and suburban living were none of them sustainable. Of one thing you can be sure, and that is that the people who donate to the Natural Resource Defense Council or the Sierra Club or even the more militant Greenpeace have no notion, no plans to do their laundry by hand on the banks of the Hudson. If you were to bring these quotes and many similar ones to the attention of the pampered middle-class folks who contribute to these organizations, they simply would refuse to take them seriously. The gap between the environmental radicals who set the agenda for these organizations and the public, with its hazy, warm feelings about the environment, because who can be against the environment, that opens the space for the games that environmentalists play. Now, the problem with this title of my talk, Games Environmentalists Play, is that games sound innocuous and these games are anything but. Their chief focus is on halting development of energy, obviously the lifeblood of Western economies. So these games have a profound impact on our daily lives and our national security. But before we get to some of these games and their corrosive impact on our national security, a little history. The modern environmentalist movement burst on the scene in 1970 in an apocalyptic panic. The rhetoric and the emotion were strikingly similar to what you get with the Armageddons around global warming. Up to then, the Earth had been a comfortable dwelling place. Now, suddenly, pollution was on the verge of making it uninhabitable. There was a sign in one of the organization's Ecology Action, we are 5 years into the biosphere self-destruct era. Now, this Ecology Action was one of 200 environmental groups that mushroomed in the San Francisco area alone during the panic. We tend to forget this. Public emotion reached its peak with Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970, and if you want a day for the start of the modern environmental movement, that's as good as any. Millions of Americans took part. Congress shut down. Members of Congress fanned out throughout the country to speak to their constituents. Traffic was cut off in downtown New York. Reporters estimated 100,000 people came into 14th Street, into the square there, for exhibits and songs. Mayor Lindsay addressed the throng, and he said the issue could be summed up. This is the level of sophistication that is common in apocalyptic fevers. He said the issue could be summed up simply: do we want to live or die? In 1980, my husband and I wrote a book called The Coercive Utopians. It focused on the ideas and activities not only of the environmentalists, but of a variety of groups with a very bleak view of American domestic institutions and America's role in the world. They range from the bureaucracies of the mainline churches to the environmentalists, to radical think tanks, to the Naderite public interest groups. All of them still around. In the book, we explained why the new left of radicals from the 1960s trooped into the environmental movement in the 1970s. Both political and environmental radicals understood that modern industrial society runs on energy. Both groups wanted to put a tourniquet around centralized energy development as the key to transforming society. Both groups wanted to see energy in short supply. Environmentalist guru Amory Lovins declared, quote, "It would be little short of disastrous for us to discover a source of clean, cheap, abundant energy because of what we might do with it." Lovins, by the way, is still going strong. He's currently touting a hugely expensive hypercar of his design, which he says, with his typical modesty, it'll spell the end of the car, oil, steel, aluminum, nuclear, and coal industries as we know them. And the corporations, by the way, are funding this to the wazoo. Even more important, environmentalists had something the political utopians of the New Left sorely needed. In nuclear power, they had an issue capable of mobilizing masses to action. The Vietnam War was winding down, depriving the New Left of its big issue. Like the war, the nuclear issue provided a lever to undermine faith in authority. It instilled a willingness to defy that authority through civil disobedience and even violence. On top of that, nuclear energy had the benefit of serving as the symbol of centralized economic, social, and military power, everything that barred the road to achievement of the utopian community of communities of which the radicals dreamed. Ralph Nader waxed for him positively lyrical as he described what it would be like when people lived in an ideal community where, and this is a quote, where it's broken down into as small parts as are economically possible, and those parts are run by the constituency for whom they are supposed to operate. People get back to the earth, grow their own gardens, feel the wind across their cheek, and watch the sun come up, not using energy. Nuclear energy had been operating safely for almost 2 decades with the approval of the major environmental organizations. Nonetheless, they were now so successful in instilling terror of nuclear power that at the beginning of the 1980s, nuclear disarmament proponents were trying to convince the public that nuclear bombs were as dangerous as nuclear energy. Chemist George Kistiakowsky, who was chairman of the Council for a Livable World, complained in 1981, and I quote, "We have problems in trying to redirect the public fear of nuclear plants into fear of nuclear war." In the media, you'll constantly see the accident at 3 Mile Island identified as the culprit in stopping the building of nuclear power plants. Now here I've heard twice or maybe 3 times Jane Fonda being given that honor, if you want to put it that way. But 3 Mile Island was only a nail in a fully prepared coffin. And Jane Fonda, the China Syndrome came out it was a week or 2 before 3 Mile Island, so it looked prophetic. But that film had, I would say, close to 0 impact on stopping nuclear power development. Well, if you doubt what I'm saying, remember, in 1977, 2 years before 3 Mile Island and 2 years before the China Syndrome, President Carter faced one of the energy crises of that period. And it was so bad, he told Americans that we faced the moral equivalent of war. Yet he came up with an energy policy in that year that totally omitted nuclear power. And remember, 1977 was also the year when he ruled out the breeder reactor and reprocessing of nuclear fuel. The anti-nukes were already riding high. But while nuclear energy was their boogeyman, the basis for demonstrations and fundraising, the new brand of environmentalists were opposed to all traditional energy sources. These represented what Amory Lovins called the hard path. The Natural Resources Defense Council, for example, brought suit against nuclear, coal, oil, and hydroelectric projects. That's when it was still small. Today it has 400 lawyers and support staff to bring its to let loose on our major sources of energy. Such was their impact that a mere 7 years after Earth Day, the Coercive Utopians were ensconced in government. The Utopians were articulate and self-confident, full of new ideas. The incoming Carter administration was disposed to give them their chance. Writing in Fortune during Carter's first year, journalist Juan Cameron identified no less than 60 consumer, environmental, and public interest advocates who had immediately moved into sub-cabinet posts and into the White House, into White House spots as advisors. Especially important, they obtained posts controlling financial spigots, outfits like Action and Vista, which still exist in under different names in other bureaucracies in the government. One bureaucrat observed, if you were a member in good standing of the New Left, you were guaranteed help if you had an organization. Of course, solar energy got its cut. It was the noble incarnation of the soft path opposed to the evil hard path of fossil energy. In 1979, Dennis Hayes was installed as director of the Department of Energy's Solar Energy Research Institute in Golden, Colorado. He had zero technical credentials, but impeccable activist ones. He was coordinator of the first Earth Day. He was coordinator of Sunday in 1978. That never took off the way Earth Day did. He was founder of the Solar Lobby. One of his achievements was to predict that by the year 2000, the U.S. would obtain 50% of its total energy needs from solar power. In fact, it obtains something like 1% from solar and wind combined, and that's 10 years after 2000. As I'm sure you won't be surprised to learn, Department of Energy bureaucrats turned out to be more interested in solar propaganda than solar hardware. When Congress provided the Department of Energy with $6 million to install solar devices in federal buildings, it diverted the money to TV programs for children, a movie, developing ideas for TV situation comedies, and so forth. The Department of Energy also used the money to hang banners promoting solar energy in federal buildings. And that was the closest to solar energy those buildings got. In the Carter years, the utopians built up high hopes. Ralph Nader organized a conference of utopian groups called Taking Charge the next 10 years. But by that time, by the time they actually held the conference, Reagan was in charge. And the utopians ran into a hard patch. Even Bill Clinton was a disappointment. But that didn't mean the utopians were in retreat. They extended their grip on the consciousness industry. The mainline churches, the universities, the mainstream media, and very important, they made steady progress in radicalizing the Democratic Party. In addition to think tanks like the Center for American Progress and the Institute for America's Future for down and dirty mobilizing in the internet age, there was the Daily Kos and the movement.org. Their triumph came in 2008 when Obama was elected president. There's a major difference between the Carter years and today. Then the Coercive Utopians obtained an important foothold in the bureaucracy, and now they are the government. Carter was a peanut farmer looking for new ideas. Obama was marinated in coercive utopian perspectives his entire life. In the pews of the Reverend Wright for 20 years, he heard repeatedly America was the embodiment of racist imperialist evil. Sitting with unrepentant weather undergrounder Bill Ayers on the boards of progressive foundations like Woods and Joyce, Obama doubtless saw nothing controversial in dispersing money to Reverend Wright's church, to Acorn, to the educational enterprises of Bill Ayers and his brother John. Obama himself was a community organizer, a typical coercive utopian line of work. He was steeped in the doctrines of Saul Alinsky and worked closely with Acorn. Many of his appointees, especially the multiplicity of czars, are straight out of the coercive utopian playbook. Global warming zealot John Holdren, of which George Gilder spoke this morning, the science czar. You heard a bit of his quotes this morning, but here's another one. Back in 1973, he declared that the goal must be, quote, to de-develop the United States. Holdren, at least, was a physicist with a long-as-your-arm resume. even if his record of being wrong was equally long. On the other hand, the combined paper and verbal trail of self-styled revolutionary communist Van Jones was so wild, he'd even signed a truther petition. He initially recognized it was insane for Obama to appoint him as Green Czar. He told a reporter, quote, "I burst out laughing because at the time it seemed completely ludicrous that it would even be an option." Of course, that didn't prevent him when his resignation as a result of Glenn Beck's expose, when he had to write a resignation letter 6 months later, that didn't prevent him from portraying himself as the victim of a vicious smear campaign. While still Green Czar, he told a youth conference in Washington, and I quote, "If all you do is have a clean energy revolution, you won't have done anything. This movement is deeper than a solar panel. Deeper than a solar panel. Don't stop there. Don't stop there." He believed in repetition. "No, we're going to change the whole system. We're going to change the whole thing. We want a new system. We want a new system." I'm sure he was pounding the podium and doing a much better job than I am. He knew how to rouse the rabble. By the way, do any of you know where he is now? Van Jones? University, which one? You're right, you're right. Princeton. Yeah, he's not at Purdue, that's lucky. Which brings us to the games that environmentalists play. They pretend to be something they are not. For example, let's look at a fantastically successful outfit that most of you probably never heard of. The Government Accountability Project. They call it GAP for short. Now, some of you may think you've heard of it because you're confusing it with the Government Accountability Office. And if you are, that's what you're supposed to do. That's exactly the idea. You're supposed to confuse it with a respectable state government agency. In fact, GAP was a spin-off of the Institute for Policy Studies, the mother of all radical think tanks, and it was far more important than 3 Mile Island and Jane Fonda combined in ending the building of nuclear power plants in this country. GAP's game plan was simple. When a nuclear plant was almost completed, sometimes just awaiting its license, GAP would go to the media with accusations of defective paperwork or inadequate paperwork or defective wells. These were its 2 favorite charges. It would demand the Nuclear Regulatory Commission issue a stop work order until a full investigation could be completed. GAP would have a whistleblower in tow, often obtained by a local anti-nuclear group that had trolled bars for workers that had been fired or were otherwise disaffected. After a while, you even got traveling whistleblowers who would go from plant to make their charges. GAP pretended it was not opposed to nuclear energy. In a statement to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, GAP declared, and I quote, "The project, GAP, is not an anti-nuclear organization. Its purpose is to prevent health and safety dangers, corruption, fraud, and other abuses." This false persona was vital because local media were essential in arousing the public and politicians, forcing the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to bend over backwards in its dealings with GAP. Americans are loath to assign bad faith to people who say that they are pursuing the public interest, and the media swallowed GAP's line whole. I wrote an article on GAP for the American Spectator in 1985, and in connection with that, I read literally hundreds of articles that appeared in the local presses of the various nuclear power plants that GAP had targeted. And I didn't see one mention ever of GAP being defined as an anti-nuclear group. It was, quote, an environmental watchdog group, a government watchdog group, a national public interest organization. Even specifically business-oriented national media were no more probing. The Wall Street Journal referred to GAP as a private watchdog group, and Business Week described it as a public interest group. Under these circumstances, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission obediently played fly to GAP's spider, launching repeatedly last-minute investigations in plant after plant, even though GAP's allegations were repeatedly shown to be inaccurate or of no significance to safety. GAP's hope was that the millions of dollars in interest payments the utilities would have to pay at this very last stage of development would force them to abandon the plant. And this worked in the case of Cincinnati's gas and electric Zimmer plant. Although there was no evidence there was anything wrong with the plant, it turned out the utility was indeed guilty of sloppy paperwork. And it faced the prospect of tearing down large portions of the plant to start the paperwork all over again. The utility threw in the towel, although the plant was 97% complete. Most of the other plants GAP targeted eventually did go online, but GAP was enormously successful nonetheless. It forced significant delays that hugely drove up costs. It created a climate of fear and distrust of nuclear power among the communities that were in the public, of the communities to be served by the targeted plants. But most important, it convinced utilities throughout the country that nuclear plants involved far too much uncertainty, expense, and adverse publicity to be worth building. As a result, no nuclear plants were even considered for the next 30 years, and we heard today that it would take a good 20 years even if they were, a plant was now to be approved by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And the anti-nukes have not yet begun to fight. Remember those 400 lawyers and support staff at the Natural Resource Defense Council alone. GAP's 1984 budget was $180,000. It staffed 3 poorly paid lawyers and a community organizer. Yet merely investigating one relatively minor charge at Consumer Midland's plant cost the Nuclear Regulatory Commission $800,000. Overall, GAP cost the nuclear industry, and of course the consumer, us, many, many billions of dollars. You had to be an original investor in Microsoft to get that much bang for your buck. To paraphrase Churchill, rarely have so few wreaked so much damage upon so many. Fast forward 30 years and not much has changed, at least when it comes to the games environmentalists play. Their cry is still that we must save the planet from imminent destruction. Now it's not pollution that's going to shut us down, but global warming. Bill McKibben is one of the most energetic popularizers of the new apocalypse. He even started 2 organizations to propagate the Green Armageddon. And he calls his new book Earth, but it's spelt with E-Arth. And that's to signify that the damage is already great, so great that the Earth as it used to exist no longer exists. We just don't know that the Earth is not there anymore. I can't resist mentioning this book because it has one of the silliest statements I've read, even from an environmentalist. McKibben talks of a team of computer experts from MIT and elsewhere who formed a group called Climate Interactive and built, just before the Copenhagen summit, and I quote, a sophisticated software model that could instantly analyze any proposal and tell you what it would mean 100 years down the road. It's interesting that for all their suspicion of technology, these people have an absolutely ludicrous faith in anything a computer can spit out. You have the same games as you did before, with environmentalist organizations paying lip service to energy development while opposing actual energy development of any sort, including the kinds they claim to support most ardently. The mine workers, the games go to the very top. On the campaign trail, Obama assured President of the United Mine Workers, Cecil Roberts, that he was, and I quote Roberts, a tremendous supporter of coal and the future of coal. On the other hand, Obama was caught offering his real views on YouTube, quote, if somebody wants to build a coal-powered plant, they can. It's just that it will bankrupt them because they're going to be charged a huge sum for all that greenhouse gas that's being emitted. Decades ago, Peter Metzger got it right. He's the scientist and writer from whom we borrowed the term coercive utopians. And Metzger said that environmentalists are enthusiastic about energy sources as long as they don't exist. And he predicted the same hostility to solar power should it become viable. And sure enough, today environmentalists are seeking to block solar energy projects on federal lands, including projects in the Mojave Desert. And that's an area that Interior Secretary Salazar has approved for solar development. Without those projects, California's bold energy plans come unglued. Governor Schwarzenegger in 2009 signed an executive order mandating that by 2020, the state's utility had to obtain 33% of their power from renewable sources. Building solar projects in the Mojave Desert was to be the key to achieving that unlikely goal. The utilities were lined up. The investing companies were lined up. There was a huge Department of Energy subsidy that was lined up, and you better believe you needed that for this. It even seemed the environmentalists were lined up. But this seeming bulldozer of a coalition was speedily outflanked by a small Southern California group called the Wildlands Conservancy. The Wildlands Conservancy opposes the plans on the usual assortment of grounds. The projects will threaten endangered species, destroy rare plants, use vast amounts of water, and require ugly transmission lines. What is most important, the Conservancy persuaded Senator Dianne Feinstein to introduce legislation in Congress that would ban renewable energy development on over 1 million acres of the Mojave Desert, making them a national monument. In a speech at Yale, Governor Schwarzenegger said plaintively, if we cannot put solar power plants in the Mojave Desert, I don't know where the hell we can put it. And innocent in the environmentalist snake pits, Schwarzenegger had thought he was in the forefront of green right thinking. That Wildlands Conservancy is on a roll. They also just managed to ban, and the city of Los Angeles gave up on a plan to build an 85-mile transmission line to bring renewable energy into Los Angeles. That's gone. Now, can anyone doubt the environmentalist storm Boone Pickens would have unleashed if his proposal to build wind farms through the Great Plains from Texas to the Canadian border had gotten so far as the drawing board? If the recession hadn't killed it, the environmentalists would have. Big or small, just about any renewable energy project will unleash the wrath of environmental groups. Environmental groups in Oregon have united to oppose construction of wind farms in the foothills of the Blue Mountains. Environmental groups have filed a federal lawsuit against a proposed wind farm in West Virginia on behalf of endangered bats. Interior Secretary Salazar recently approved the Cape Wind Project. You must have seen material on that in Nantucket, saying it's the vanguard of a clean energy revolution. Well, environmental opponents have since filed lawsuits against Cape Wind, charging violations of the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Outer Continental Shelflands Act, the Clean Water Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the River and Harbors Act, and tribal protection laws. The Mashpee and other Indian tribes claim they need unobstructed views of Nantucket Sound to carry out spiritual sun greetings. As the Wall Street Journal points out, the laws spawned by the last clean energy revolution are being used to wipe out this one, which, given how uneconomic these various projects are, may be a good thing. As for hydropower, more than a dozen environmental groups in Ohio are blocking the development of a hydroelectric dam to replace an existing dam there. Although it's a green energy project, complete with fish migration assistance, the environmental group groups want the existing dam to be torn down with no replacement. And indeed, quite a few dams are being torn down, letting the rivers run free, but with no hydroelectric power to replace what's being lost. All of this suggests why William Tucker's well-intentioned effort to create an alliance between solar advocates and those seeking a renaissance of nuclear power is a non-starter. Such a solar-nuclear alliance would depend on Tucker's intended partners having a good faith commitment to expanding energy production as long as it could be done without the dreaded carbon footprint. In other words, it overlooks the games environmentalists play. To further his proposed solar-nuclear coalition, Tucker is willing to buy into the global warming apocalypse, even though he admits it's hyped. In his, in many ways, excellent book, Terrestrial Energy, Tucker describes his effort to enlist Amory Lovins. I mean, he was really going for the source. Tucker writes of winding his way through the Colorado mountains to the home of the Green Guru, but he doesn't even manage to see him. The fact is that however persuasive his arguments, Tucker is not likely to peel off any major environmental group. Yes, Patrick Moore, the co-founder of Greenpeace, is a convert to nuclear power, but you'll notice he didn't convert Greenpeace. He had to leave and start off on his own. Environmental organizations have grown comfortable with their anti-nuke stance, and they don't want to disturb the circles of their members and donors. Most important, they certainly don't want to make themselves the target of other environmentalist groups who would be sure to label them as sellouts to big corporations if they were suddenly to embrace nuclear power. In the environmental movement, it's the radicals who have the moral upper hand and who steer the ship for the bigger outfits, or at least make sure they don't veer too far off course. I believe, and we heard about this this morning too, the entire pro-nuclear lobby makes a big mistake in climbing on the global warming bandwagon. They think that benefits them because nuclear power is emissions-free, but that is short-term thinking in the extreme. They are blinding themselves to the anti-development ideology at the heart of the movement. The argument that you should support nuclear power because it is emissions-free depends on reason, and reason is beside the point here. There's a scientific veneer, but that's all that it is. It's faith, not facts, that rule. As Peter Beckman once pointed out, you can't tell an Orthodox rabbi the burning bush contradicts the law of the conservation of energy. Environmentalism is often described as if it were a competing faith, but it's more than that. It's not a standalone competitor to Judaism and Christianity. It's a faith that has been incorporated into the major religions, into the established religions, and it now pervades them. Many of the resolutions of the National Council of Churches could have been written by Greenpeace. The following is from the prayer of confession that the National Council of Churches offered up in response to the current oil spill in the Gulf. Quote, "We have acted with craven disregard for complex ecosystems we barely understand. Our self-deception has led us to assume we have the capacity to manage environments we exploit to sustain lifestyles that defy the intrinsic interdependence of all life. Now we face the consequences of our idolatry." Now, given how far the underlying perspective here is from the traditional Judeo-Christian view of the relation of man and nature, some might question where the idolatry lies. It's a frustrating uphill battle to fight faith with facts. On the other hand, there's an upside. Faiths wax, but they also wane. And if environmentalism is still standing, as we've heard here repeatedly, faith in global warming is definitely waning. The exposure of the shenanigans at the University of East Anglia's Climate Research Unit seems to have been the trigger, but I agree with others who've said that the bubble was probably set to burst anyway. Like the housing bubble, it quickly rose to absurd heights, and the air had to come out. What's going on in England is especially interesting. If any of you watch the BBC, you must have noticed how obsessed the English have been with man-made global warming. But now the New York Times reports that a BBC poll has found that only 26% of Britons believe in it. Now that's a huge collapse. And it's had its effect on politicians there. Here, I'm not so sure. I'm less optimistic than Mark Morano, certainly in the short run, because the EPA and the politicians and the alarmist scientists here are still going on as if nothing had happened. And that's because for so many of our politicians, global warming is a godsend, a crisis too good to waste, as Rahm Emanuel would say. As Christopher Horner pointed out last night, it's a chance to seize control over energy, the driver of our economy. Seizing of control of our healthcare system pales in comparison. The games environmentalists play in depriving us of the ability to tap our own energy resources have already had a profound impact upon our national security. Without dependable energy, we cannot fulfill our responsibilities as a great power. Back in 1970, we produced over 80% of the oil we consumed, and today it's only 34%. You can invoke the mantra green energy all you like, but transportation, including our ability to move our troops, still overwhelmingly depends on oil. The new energy we thought would come online increasingly looks like a mirage. The British petroleum disaster gave Obama the excuse he admits he wasn't sorry to have to stop coal, the promised renewal of deep water drilling. The less we drill, the more we depend on foreign oil. Now, some free market economists will say this doesn't matter, it's no cause for concern, but much of our oil comes from unstable or unfriendly countries or both. More than a quarter of our foreign oil comes from Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. The fact that we have a strategic petroleum reserve speaks to our recognition that our oil supplies are not secure. As you know, we created it in 1975 in the wake of the Middle East countries withholding their oil after the Yom Kippur War. Our dependence on foreign oil has profoundly affected our national security in ways that we sometimes tend to overlook. Well, what does Saudi Arabia do with all that oil money? Sure, some of it is frittered away on high living for those hundreds of princes, and what's left of French haute couture depends on what those wives of those princes are wearing under their burqas. But over the last 35 years, close to $100 billion has gone to madrasas and Islamic centers and Islamic colleges and mosques around the world. These preach Wahhabi doctrine and provide a breeding ground and support network for jihadists around the world. Goodly sums go to convert and radicalize our prison population. Alexei Alexeyev, writing in National Review, said, quote, "There is hardly a city of any size in America or Europe today that does not have a Saudi-controlled institution preaching extremism and spewing hatred against Western civilization, directly or indirectly advocating its destruction. Incredibly, it looks as if we'll have one of these at ground zero, on the site of a building that was destroyed in 9/11. The local community board unanimously approved a $100 million Islamic center and mosque, the money sure to come chiefly from the Saudis. Huge sums flow directly to terrorists. A 2002 report to the UN Security Council found that Al-Qaeda and fellow jihadists had collected between $300 and $500 million, mostly from Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabian and private, it's not from Saudi Arabia as a country, but from Saudi charities and private donors. The money still flows. Last week, the London Times reported that in the last 4 years, Saudi donors, this is the last 4 years, have sent almost $1 billion to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. That's money tracked by the Afghan Financial Intelligence Unit FINTRACA, which I guess stands for financial tracking. What's more, FINTRACA reports that the flow is increasing, that it peaked last year. That's all oil money, much of it our money, going to kill our troops. Without oil, Saudi Arabia would have remained a collection of picturesque Bedouin living in tents. The World Trade Center would still be standing, and our armies would not be fighting in Afghanistan and probably not in Iraq either. Filled close to capacity as it is now, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve gives us a 34-day supply of oil. That's not a long time given the potential disruptions out there. It now seems almost inevitable that, barring Israeli action, Iran will have its nuclear bomb. Ahmadinejad has repeatedly promised to eradicate Israel in a single strike, and it's foolish to dismiss the threats as meaningless rhetoric. Israel is usually considered as a passive victim, but don't forget, Israel has nuclear bombs, and if it comes under nuclear attack, is likely to use them. After a nuclear exchange, it's hard to imagine oil flowing smoothly through the Middle East for quite some time to come. The oil-rich Gulf states are just as frightened, or almost equally frightened, of a nuclear Iran. Iran has issued open threats to take over several of the Gulf states, including Kuwait, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. In the words of leading Iranian cleric Ayatollah Karazi, this will be prelude, quote, to the single global rule of the Mahdi. The Gulf states don't think this is meaningless rhetoric. They recently held a summit to complain of their fears of what Iran will do. What we consider rationality is in short supply in the new members of the nuclear club. Presumably made confident by its bomb, North Korea destroyed a South Korean ship, which is an act of war. It's impossible to know in advance precisely what the mullahs will do, but it seems highly probable that once Iran has the bomb, it will be emboldened to embark on adventures that will have serious consequences for the entire West's oil supply. Almost 40% of the world's traded oil goes through the Straits of Hormuz. If a nuclear Iran merely threatened to cut it off, oil prices would rise to the stratosphere and Europe would be forced to submit to Iran's political demands. It's not only our environmentalists who know how to play games, as Iran's toying with the West over its nuclear program now for the last couple of years shows they are expert at playing games. The irony is that if it were not for the obstructionism of environmentalists and the pandering to them of the political class, our energy options would be greater than ever. The Wall Street Journal of May 10th has an article headed, "How Shale Gas is Going to Rock the World." New techniques of hydraulic fracturing or fracking and horizontal drilling have vastly expanded our domestic natural gas reserves and have already brought down the price of gas significantly. Plentiful gas can reduce our need for oil, including in transportation. Perhaps the recent discovery of a way to make cells and test tubes will bring the era of man-made oil closer to fruition than we think. Of course, the environmentalists are already gearing up to obstruct the development of shale gas, and there'll be help. Last week there was a blowout at an of a gas well in Pennsylvania that was using fracking, and there were several natural gas pipe explosions last week to make things worse. And some of the environmentalist groups have already expressed dismay at the advance by Craig Ventnor and his company in artificially creating cells. And of course, after the dismay come the lawsuits. Which leads to the big final question: what can we do to stop the radical green agenda, which, like a jungle vine, has wrapped itself around the most vulnerable parts of our economy? Well, as an antidote, I propose green tea. Reportedly, it has many salubrious effects on the human body. It also can return to health our body politic, at least taken in the form I am thinking of, a green tea party. I should add, though, in light of Tom DeWeese's excellent and frightening speech yesterday on the infiltration of Lyndon LaRouche into the Tea Party groups, that we would have to be awfully sure that such a Tea Party was rigorously purged from the LaRouchites and others with hidden agendas that could destroy it and would certainly be attracted to it. But the fact is that we need a grassroots movement that focuses on exposing the environmentalist movement for what it is: a shrill, deceptive, anti-progress, anti-development, anti-human, millenarian sect. It's time to save the environment from this sect. It's time for a Green Tea Party that will take the environmental movement back to its roots. Its roots are in the conservation movement. That was the movement pioneered by Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot that wanted to save, conserve beautiful places, and manage resources wisely. Its goal was to enhance human life and not to send us to an energy dark ages. The environmentalist movement wishes to turn back the clock on American progress. Let's turn the clock back on them and send their movement to its sane beginnings. Our country's continued freedom and prosperity depends on our success in doing just that.
We have time for a few questions. All right.
At the end of the 19th century, there was an environmental movement in Germany, very, very active, and we saw the results in 1933. Do you see any parallel today in this country?
Well, I don't know that the environmentalist movement produced Hitler. You had this romantic environmentalist movement in Germany, which Hitler tapped into. That's true enough. I hope not. There are all too many possible parallels between now and 1930s Weimar, but I hope not.
I've got a question, and it involves the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And do you see history repeating itself, specifically in the late 1970s? A president that Jay Lear this morning called brilliant installed two anti-nuclear commissioners, a lawyer named Bradford from Maine and another fellow named Galinsky, to put the boot on NRC's neck. I was working there at the time. Today's equivalent being a man named Jacko or Jaco, I don't know how to pronounce his name, an anti-nuclear Harry Reid staffer. So my question is this another instance of history repeating itself?
Well, at that point, you had at least the Nuclear Regulatory Commission thought its role was commissioning nuclear plants. They haven't commissioned a nuclear plant in over 30 years. And even if they were to, the process would go on for so long. So, it almost doesn't matter that you have someone like that on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, because 20 years from now is a huge amount of time in which you could, which would be the minimum time that you could expect. What we've done is create such litigation opportunities that companies want certainty, and the only certainty they have if they're going to start on nuclear power is lawsuits. That's the certainty. So it's not a prospect that you wonder that any of them even want to take on the beginning of the process.
Do you have any specific guidelines for putting the T, something similar to Reagan's 12 Commandments, anything that you would ask the T movement to install? Or
Well, that's something to, I would think about. I hadn't thought of commandments for it. Obviously, one of them is to be awfully careful who you accept in your movement. We now, forewarned is forearmed, that you can't let yourself be taken over by another cult. But that would certainly be something, if we were to have a Green Tea Party, to start out with those 10 commandments and to think what they should be.
Okay, if there are no more questions, thank you very much again, Dr. Isaac. And we will start again at 2:30 next door. Thank you. See you then.